Hi everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. So if you want to discuss your own motorsport organization's finances or strategy, you can get in touch with me at contact@vaucheranalytics.com. Now, for the past episodes of Return on Racing, I've really taken a deep dive on a very strategic issue, which is the competition that legacy automakers face with regards to Chinese EVs, and specifically how motorsport can really help build a competitive advantage. Today, I want to drill into an aspect of that, which I'm going to tie back to at the end, but I think we can all agree that this is one of the more fun parts of motorsport, and that's liveries. Now, liveries are fun because they're colorful and they just add to the sensory appeal of what makes racing so great. But rather than talk about something relatively obvious or boring like the top 10 most racing liveries, I want to put some structure around it and somewhat paradoxically get into why there aren't these iconic liveries today. So, if you go back to that hypothetical top 10 list, why would they all be from decades ago? So let's talk about the death of the iconic racing livery and what teams must change to revive it. So I was watching a documentary on Lancia called Lancia, The Legend of Rally recently, and it was fantastic. What stood out in particular was not only the performance of the cars, but the coherence of their visual identity. The Alitalia and Martini racing liveries extended seamlessly from the bodywork to the mechanics overall and support environment. To me, a set of green Alitalia overalls in those service parks at that time does not read as a crude advertising vehicle. Rather, they feel like a natural expression of a shared world. Naturally, that makes the underlying brand more desirable. And watching this footage 40 years later, I did not feel I was being sold to at all. If anything, I found myself wanting to look up Alitalia flights. By contrast, many contemporary programs, even at the very top of the sport, project a very different impression. A modern Formula One car carrying a financial services or technology brand, among so many other logos, often appears visually fragmented with sponsors assembled onto the chassis rather than integrated into a coherent identity. This is particularly striking in the case of teams with historically rigorous commercial standards. The juxtaposition between the myth-making of a Lancia-era livery and a current logo-heavy car highlights a clear perceptual gap. That gap is not simply a matter of nostalgia or personal taste. It goes to the core of how motorsport sponsorship has evolved, from a small number of deep, identity-defining partnerships to a fragmented model built around logo real estate and short-term revenue optimization. The difference is structural, rooted in the way deals are constructed, how design authority is exercised, which categories dominate the grid, and how risk and regulation are managed. This episode of Return on Racing examines those underlying drivers and explores what teams can do in practical terms to recover some of the cultural and commercial power that liveries like Alitalia and Martini still command decades later. So let's talk about this progression from identity partnerships to logo collages. The starting point is structural. In the era of Lancia Alitalia and Lancia Martini, sponsorship meant a handful of major partners who effectively co-owned the team's identity. The documentary states that team boss Cesare Fiorio's aim was to land one major sponsor. That actually was part of the approach, was to have not multiple sponsors, but one funding launches rally campaigns. These sponsors were not simply present on the car. The entire aesthetic universe was built around them. The car, the mechanics overalls, the service trucks, the pit signage and printed posters all belong to the same visual system. And think back to the fact that this was at a time when commercialism and marketing was far less developed than it is today. So, on one hand, sure, there were less surfaces to manage. But on the other hand, from that smaller footprint, you had an entire world built off of it. In contemporary Formula One, the WEC, and most professional series, the commercial logic is very different. Budgets are much larger, scrutiny is higher, and teams close the gap not with one or two anchor partnerships, but with a long tail of smaller deals. The commercial product is literally expressed in square centimeters of what you might call inventory. Side pods, rear wings, front wings, halo, overalls, caps, hospitality walls, all of that has a price associated with it. And the resulting aesthetic is clear without being clear, if that makes sense. When a car carries 20 plus unrelated brands, it can only ever look like a collage. When a team swaps sponsors every season, or even mid season in some dramatic cases, no visual identity has the time to become iconic. The Lancia overalls that you remember and that I remember were not just beautifully designed, they were consistent year on year until they imprinted themselves on people's minds. Most modern partnerships are too short lived and too shallow to achieve that same effect. With the cost of racing always increasing and sponsors' marketing budgets squeezed constantly, it seems unlikely that racing teams, even at the top levels, will be able to secure single payer multi year deals anymore. However, I've already outlined in previous episodes of Return on Racing and previous articles on the website an alternate financial model in which top teams generate more of their revenue through owned intellectual property. With this approach, sponsors could provide the additional funds required to race and gain essentially exclusive access to the team's ad services, and I'll touch on that later. Under this paradigm, the results would be synergistic. The effort required from each party would be substantial, so the racing teams have to create their IP that generates revenue, the sponsors have to dig deeper into their pockets. But the potential to return to a single company with iconic liveries is increased, leading to more brand association for the sponsor. One example that stood out to me recently was the Sunoco livery for Chip Ganassi's number 8 IndyCar, set to race in 2026. It made an immediate splash when it was revealed, and the livery is unusual today in that it is designed almost entirely around one sponsor, that is Sunoco. And because of this, because of the fact that it is so unusual in today's landscape, it really made a splash when it was announced. And if you go visit the Vush Analytics website, and I'll link to the article in the show notes, you can see a picture of this IndyCar, and hopefully I think you will agree with the effect, which is that it turned out really, really well. So let's dig more into this and talk about design logic, where basically worlds versus PowerPoint approaches are pitted against each other. So the second layer of this analysis is design. Classic liveries were conceived as coherent visual worlds. The Alitalia scheme is essentially a few strong elements: white as the base, the Italian tricolore geometry, and a bold logo type. Martini racing is a disciplined rhythm of blue and red stripes, deployed with almost architectural rigor across different cars and series. Those systems had a few common traits. Logos were simple, legible, and designed for physical media. Color palettes were restricted and carefully balanced. Less really was more in these cases. Lines flowed with the shape of the car rather than fighting it, and crucially, the same logic extended to overalls, jackets, banners, and trucks. The result is that a fan looking at the car and the crew saw a single, unified identity, and of course associated that so closely with the sponsor themselves. By contrast, much of today's motorsport branding looks like the export of a corporate brand book onto a chassis. It's rough, but if you think about it, it becomes true very quickly. Many logos have been designed for websites and app icons rather than for a high-speed, three-dimensional object. They are long names, gradients, tiny trademark symbols, and slogans that only read clearly on a laptop or smartphone. The base livery is often developed first, then sponsors are dropped into predefined boxes according to a placement deck and, of course, how much the sponsor has agreed to pay. The result is very different. The car reads as visually restless rather than resolved. One gets the impression that in the golden age, before racing became so corporatized, someone with aesthetic authority was clearly empowered to say, "This is what our world looks like." And maybe that was just the team boss, but there was one final person saying, "This is what we want our car to convey to the viewing public." In the modern era, design is often a downstream function whose job is to accommodate the commercial plan, for instance, and fans instinctively feel that inversion. A Lancia and Alitalia colors looks like it could not exist any other way, while a car covered in unintegrated brands looks like it could have been something else until quite late in the process. So let's now talk about category, culture, and fit. Another driver of perception is category fit. The sponsors that defined the golden age of motorsport liveries were often tightly linked to the emotional territory of the sport. Alitalia on a Lancia and the World Rally Championship feels logical at a narrative level. It is the national carrier backing an Italian car in a global competition. Speed and national pride align, and of course, the glamour of the jet age was still present even in the early 1980s. Martini on Lancia or Porsche operates in the same space. It is a lifestyle brand associated with nightlife, glamour, and risk. It makes intuitive sense that a Martini logo would appear on something noisy, dangerous, and glamorous. Now, absolutely, cigarettes and alcohol are problematic categories for many reasons. But from a purely semiotic standpoint, they fit. They are sensory, visceral products in categories where danger and reward are never far apart. They sit naturally alongside a sport built on noise, speed, and controlled risk. Modern sponsorship has migrated into very different categories. Payment networks, banks, cloud providers, software platforms, crypto exchanges, and insurance companies dominate grid after grid. These businesses are absolutely rational partners. They have global footprints, marketing budgets, and a need for differentiation. And we thank them for participating because that is what keeps cars going racing. But what they do not naturally bring is a strong sensory or emotional hook. They're selling intangible, often business to business services that feel increasingly distant from the average fan's daily life. In theory, using the sensory nature of racing to make these brands feel less abstract seems obvious. In practice, if the service remains intangible and the logo is simply there, though, do fans ever feel really compelled to look the company up, let alone actually feel any emotion about it? That mismatch is part of what you are reacting to when a card network logo appears on a papaya car. It does not feel like part of the fantasy. It just feels like an advertisement dropped into the frame. Now, the partner can still get business value, but the visual and cultural coherence that made Alitalia and Martini iconic is so much harder to achieve. And there are reasons for this. So now let's talk about economics, risk, and brand guidelines. Behind all of this sit the unglamorous realities of money, risks, and processes. Modern racing programs are expensive and heavily scrutinized by boards and shareholders. Even with cost controls, the pressure to maximize commercial revenue is relentless. The easiest levers to pull are to add more partners, to sell more services, and to shorten commitments to keep options open. But none of those incentives favor clean, disciplined design. At the same time, large global corporations enforce strict brand guidelines. They require unaltered, full color logos, minimum sizes, clear space rules, and tightly defined usage. From a corporate control standpoint, this is rational. But from a livery standpoint, and I think we can even use the term artistic here, it is highly constraining. A team cannot recolor or reinterpret a mark to fit into a pre existing visual system. It has to drop the logo somewhere that satisfies the guidelines, even if that breaks the aesthetic or contributes to a cluttered aesthetic to start with. Regulatory and ESG constraints have also removed or restricted the categories that once brought a certain illicit edge. And I'm not passing judgment on this, I'm not saying it's bad, but we can speak factually. Tobacco is heavily restricted, alcohol is tightly managed, gambling is controversial. New sponsors often come from afar, more regulated sectors that carry different expectations around messaging and representation. When you combine financial pressure, rigid guidelines, and category shifts, the outcome is predictable. The car becomes a dense, risk-managed compilation of assets rather than a clean expression of a shared identity, and the emotional impact suffers accordingly. So here is what fans are actually perceiving as a result of all of this. When I wrote that I did not feel marketed to by the Alitalia or Martini overalls, what I'm conveying is coherence. Everything in that world is speaking the same visual language, so it ceases to feel like persuasion and starts to feel like environment. The mechanics' uniforms are simply what people wear in that universe, or rather wore since we're talking decades in the past now. The airline and the car company are part of the same project. Modern branding breaks that illusion. It is extremely obvious when the seams are between team identity and sponsor obligation. You can see them, you can feel them. Fans instantly recognize the car as a compilation of contracts. And that is why a logo that might look unobjectionable on a card terminal or banner suddenly feels jarring on a side post or rear wing. So I've talked about the problem. Now let's talk about some ways forward and how teams can start bringing the magic back. If teams genuinely want to bring some of that magic back, they have to accept that this is not primarily a design exercise. It is a commercial and governance decision. The product being sold to sponsors, in other words, has to evolve. The first change is to rebalance quantity and depth. Instead of aiming for maximum logo counts, teams should aim for a small or at least a smaller number of partners who are willing to co-own the identity over several seasons. That means structuring a top tier of agreements where the partner buys more than visibility. They buy long-term association with a visual and cultural asset that the team intends to protect and grow. Now again, this will be expensive upfront, but the potential returns from a truly memorable livery are significant in compounding. That in turn requires a shift in how value is presented. Many modern deals will evaporate the moment the contract ends. Teams can position integrated identity partnerships as a different asset class entirely. Rather than leading with impressions and broadcast seconds, the conversation needs to include the long tail value of iconic status. Things such as recurring merchandise sales years after the program ends, inclusion in media, not simple content that stirs emotions, diecasts and retrospectives, and a place really in the emotional memory of the sport. I mean, I don't even drink, and I think the Martini livery looks phenomenal. Consider that the Alitalia livery also still sells model cars and prints. That's how strong the association is. And I think that when people think of the Lancia Stratos, when they think of Lancia itself, Alitalia is not far behind. The second change is to elevate creative authority. There needs to be a clear creative director or design lead whose mandate is not just to make it work, but to define a visual system and enforce it. Perhaps this person could even come from outside of the racing world. In fact, I saw Cadillac just appointed a design director recently. I am really, really excited to see what that brand produces in terms of liveries. Now, if a team can show sponsors that their logo, when adapted carefully, will live longer and more powerfully in fans' minds, many will accept thoughtful integration over brute force size. A third lever now is the extension of identity beyond the car itself. Classic programs made the entire environment part of the canvas. Again, I've said this previously in the episode, there was less of a footprint, but they made a lot work within that footprint. Workshops, pit walls, hospitality units, and mechanics clothing all follow the same logic. And modern teams can recover some of that by treating mechanic suits and team outerwear as hero products rather than afterthoughts. Clean, bold, sponsor integrated overalls that fans would actually want to wear as fashion items build far more equity than cluttered, fireproof billboards. And if you want more examples of this, just look up your favorite airline. It's very likely that at some point they have partnered with a high fashion brand to design the flight attendants' uniforms. McDonald's has done this as well. So there's an understanding that these uniforms are more than just uniforms, or more than just, in the case of racing, more area to put logos on. There's got to be something greater that they're building towards. The fourth element is how teams collaborate with sponsors on the narrative side. If a sponsor is willing to accept a more integrated, perhaps more subtle logo treatment, the team can repay that with richer storytelling. Instead of simply appearing in obligatory logo walls and lower thirds, the partner can be woven into behind-the-scenes films about the design process, limited edition merchandise drops, special event liveries at key races, and co-created content that explains the thinking behind the look. And this is very different value-wise, and it's a very different value proposition from buying a rectangular space on the side pod of a car. Finally, series themselves have tools they can use if they are serious about aesthetics as part of their product. This is a little bit delicate since we're talking about dictating how teams look and manage their arrangements, but it's not out of the line of reasonable thinking. And in this line of thinking, racing series can set guidelines on maximum sponsor counts, restrict certain areas to maintain legibility, or even create awards and promotional bonuses for teams that demonstrate outstanding visual coherence and fan resonance. They do not have to turn every grid into a spec series visually, but they can tilt the system away from uncontrolled clutter. I want to wrap this up by really driving home that this is not just a design nostalgia project. This really is building towards a strategic choice and the long-term value of a racing team. The key point for teams and sponsors is that this is not about retro for retro's sake. It is about recognizing that some of the most valuable motorsport sponsorships in history achieved their status because they were treated as identity projects, not as media buys. They were that, obviously, but they came to be much more because of how they were managed. Alitalia and Martini are still referenced, reproduced, and monetized today because they were allowed to become part of the sport's visual DNA. In the modern off-track competitive landscape, and here's where I'm going to bring things full circle, as I mentioned I would at the beginning of the episode, This is a time where Chinese EVs threaten legacy automakers' established markets. Racing heritage is a crucial differentiator which must be reinforced at every opportunity, and this is a clear avenue by which to do that. Modern teams are operating under much tougher constraints, but they're not powerless in this. They can decide to sell fewer but richer partnerships. They can enforce a visual system rather than surrender to a patchwork. They can present iconic status as a concrete long-term asset to sponsors rather than a romantic side effect. And they can put someone in the organization whose job is to protect that asset with the same seriousness that a technical director protects performance. There is no reason that a modern F1 team couldn't become an actual luxury brand if steps were taken in the direction I've talked about today. If they do that, the next generation of fans may talk about a current livery with the same enthusiasm you feel watching Lancia footage now, or Lotus footage now, or pick your favorite team that has an iconic livery that would belong on your hypothetical top 10 list. This is not because someone cleverly optimized logo impressions. This happens because a car, a sponsor, and a team agreed to build a world together and then had the discipline to stick to it and build on it. I want to close out this episode of Return on Racing as I always do, which is by saying sincerely, thank you for choosing to spend your time with me. If you enjoy these insights and you want more of them, please consider signing up for the Return on Racing newsletter. This is a newsletter that is sent periodically to your inbox, the idea being to deliver quick, actionable insights that you can apply immediately to your motorsport organization. If this sounds good, you can visit the Voce Analytics website at www.voceanalytics.com, and the sign-up form will be right there on the homepage. Also linked to it directly in the show notes. Also, if you want to drop the show a line, you can always do that. The address is contact@voceanalytics.com. You can contact me for anything, even if that's just telling me your own top 10 list of iconic liveries. Again, I want to thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me here on Return on Racing, and I really look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.